All right, everyone, I think we're going to get started with this month's webinar. I want to welcome all of our attendees for tuning in today. If you've been with us before, I want to say welcome back. And if you're new to our webinar series, it's wonderful to have you with us. Again, my name is Dr. Accdon-LetPub. I'm a senior associate editor at LetPub, and I'm also our research communications strategist. I'm your main host today, but with me today is my co-host, Dr. Rong Han, who is our managing editor of scientific editing at LetPub. This is the first webinar of the 2021 LetPub webinar series. If you've been with us before, you might notice that things are a little bit different this time around. First and foremost, we are still using Zoom, but we are streaming through the academic social network or online platform PeerRef. So we encourage you to discover and explore PeerRef after the webinar today. Not all things are different. We will still have an extensive Q&A between myself and Rong at the end of the webinar, following the material on our webinar topic today, which is Guide to Publishing in Top-Tier International Journals, which is the goal of most, if not all, academics within their career. Importantly, just a few notes on housekeeping before we get started. For all of the questions that you want to ask us, or for any technical issues, if you cannot hear, you cannot see me, please just input that information into the discussion board, which is to the right of the video stream in PeerRef. Again, any questions that you have related to the material are welcome. Rong and I are more than happy to discuss those questions and answer them at the end of this webinar. And if we do not get to all of those questions, a great function of PeerRef is that we have these active discussion hubs, which will be able to continue the webinar the conversation post-webinar after this for the rest of the month. As usual, you will still be able to have an on-demand recording of today's webinar. This is something that you can re-register for within the original webinar link. And you can have a certificate of completion will also be provided. Both of these will be in the email follow-up that you'll receive a few days after this presentation. So with that, I want to get started on the material. However, as usual, I just want to give a little bit more background on myself if you don't know me. Again, my name is Dr. Accdon-LetPub, AV for short. I'm a senior associate editor and research communications strategist here at LetPub. Prior to joining scholarly publishing, I was a geologist and a geochemist. I focused my work in Chile and Peru during my master's. And then for my PhD, I jumped from the Southern Hemisphere to the Northern Hemisphere and worked on reconstructing mountain glacier change using a variety of different geochronological methods on the glaciers that are in Greenland. And I did my work both at the University of New Hampshire in New Hampshire, United States, and the University at Buffalo, which is in New York, also within the United States. I am also very happy to introduce my co-host today, which is my colleague, Dr. Rong Han. So Rong, if you want to jump in real quick and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yep, you're all set. Awesome.
I got my degree in cell biology from Peking University in China, and then I did years of research in an academic setting. Before I joined LetPub, I was a research instructor in Boston University. So my research involved using molecular and cellular methods and animal models to study genes and cells, how they function in development and in disease. Yeah. All right. Back to you,
awesome.
Ivy.
Yeah, sounds good. So Rong's going to rejoin us at the end for the Q&A. But again, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and Rong will be there with you in the discussion board on PeerRef to answer any of those questions if there's any technical difficulties. So in terms of our presentation for today, this is kind of just the outline of where I'm going to go. Initially, the question is really why publish, and specifically why publish in international journals? What are the benefits of that, and how is that going to further your career, and why is that important? One thing that I also want to touch on are some common author mistakes. So when researchers, whether they're from a native English speaking country or from any other country that doesn't speak English as the first language, try to publish in international journals, what are some of those common author mistakes? And specifically, how can you as researchers learn how to avoid those moving forward? The bulk of our presentation today is going to be kind of this guide or this 8 steps to increasing your acceptance in international journals. And then lastly, I do want to touch on what's appropriate for high impact journals, how you can kind of assess your research about whether or not it has a good chance to be accepted in a high impact journal, when to choose one of those and when to not to choose one of those. And then finally, Rong and I will address the questions that you put into that discussion board on PeerRef in the Q&A after this presentation. So the first question is, why publish in international academic journals? There's kind of 4 points that I want to cover here. The first 2 are on this page. The first, of course, is prestige. Publishing in general makes you, and specifically the research that you're conducting, stand out. As a result of being published, this kind of puts you on the map. This can lead to connections and collaborations, some of which might be at your own institution or within different institutions within your country, or perhaps some international collaborations down the road. Of course, getting published is a very exciting part of an academic's life, and it can increase your self-confidence, as you're likely going to be publishing more and more in the future if you stay within academia and perhaps within industry as well. Publishing also leads to recognition of your research, specifically your contributions to the field. By publishing, your research becomes recognized both within and outside of your specific scientific niche. If you do choose to publish in a high impact journal or a journal that's perhaps the top in your field, this can lead you to have more citations as a researcher, and that can, in many ways, among others, establish you within your discipline. Strong papers that are published in well-known journals, perhaps international journals, can generally assist with you attaining employment, promotion in your existing job, if you're a graduate student, admission into top schools, and then also career advancement if you're just within industry. Because drafting concise, well-written manuscripts takes time and effort, a bonus of publishing in general, and also publishing in these top-tier journals, is that you ultimately improve your writing skills. And by extension of that, you learn many necessary skills and important skills that you'll be using later on in your education and in your career. How to express your ideas clearly, how to consolidate your ideas, how to learn from others, reuse their materials in the appropriate way and move forward. And last but definitely not least is, by publishing, you are contributing to the international scientific community. Publishing allows you to share your findings from your research with others, which ultimately allows those individuals to utilize the research and the breakthroughs that you've come across, and then also improve upon your findings, basically move science forward. So the benefits of publishing, and specifically international publishing, are clear. There is also, of course, the other side to why publish, and that may be simply because it's required of you. There's really no way around it. Publishing is truly essential to a successful career in academia. It's likely a job requirement that you're going to encounter, regardless of what country you're from and which countries you choose to publish in. Specifically, if you're a faculty member, it's likely that publishing a certain number of papers or papers with certain requirements is required for your career promotion. This might be advancing within your department or specifically obtaining tenure. If you're a graduate student, specifically a PhD student, it's likely highly encouraged or even required that you publish in order to earn your degree. So there is definitely some stress put on all of us in terms of publishing. And then if you're an undergraduate student, publishing can also really set you apart from others. It can be very helpful for getting you accepted as a future graduate student. It gives you more experience perhaps than your peers, and it shows your potential advisor that you're really committed to not only doing research, but also getting it out there to the public. In industry, publishing may also be required, perhaps if you're a research scientist working in a lab. This is Publishing is less required, I think, in industry in general, but publications, of course, show that you are, again, committed, interested in your research, and willing to get it out there, which could ultimately lead to a bonus, perhaps, career promotion, and again, just that personal satisfaction of enjoying what you do and getting it out there for others. So the question is how can we increase our chances of journal acceptance, and specifically international journal acceptance? So in general, research scientists need to address important questions that are part of the field, design good experiments that are not flawed, that are well thought out and comprehensive. You want to be able to generate solid data that's reproducible and accountable. You want to make sure that you're analyzing your data appropriately using the appropriate statistical framework, making sure that it's comprehensive so that you're not caught off guard by, say, a reviewer who wants you to analyze your data differently. And you need to interpret the data appropriately and then convey the findings properly and clearly in your manuscript. And I list all of these things here, and perhaps when you're listening, none of those are surprising for how you could get your manuscript accepted in a journal. And that's an important take-home point, is all of these points that you've probably heard about how to get published, they're still applicable to how to get published in an international journal. And just keep these in the back of your mind that, you know, good science is good science, and that's what's going to get published. So before we move forward to our specific guide, I do want to highlight again those common author mistakes that once a manuscript lands on a journal editor's desk, these are the points that may make them second guess that your work deserves to be published in that journal, or that they may actually turn your paper around to you without peer review because of the following mistakes. First, the literature cited might be myopic, so very narrow in perspective. It may only be from one country or one region specifically. So if you're trying to publish internationally and all your references are from one country only, that's not going to show that your research is very international in scope. Oftentimes, manuscripts may be authored by only a small subset of institutions, or perhaps only one institution, or a very small subset of collaborators, perhaps people from one individual department. And this is something that might not necessarily be something that you can be avoiding, especially if you're an early career researcher or a graduate student. Like, you're likely going to be publishing with your lab group and your specific mentor. But maybe down the road, as you start to establish your career in academia, specifically as faculty, it's good to have collaborations, specifically international ones. Oftentimes, researchers that are trying to publish in international journals, the geography of where their study areas might be somewhat unclear. You might be extremely familiar with your backyard, your country, where things are, the regional terminology, but an international reader isn't. So it's really important to provide context for the research that you're doing for someone that has never been there before. One of the main reasons that a journal editor may reject a paper for an international journal is that the implications of your research are not transferable outside either the study area that you're working in, the region that you're from, or perhaps the culture. This is something that is very important to ensure that you have very clearly stated in your research, whether that's in your discussion section, your cover letter, or your conclusions. It's also important, and there's no way around it, but language is something that is essential for publication in an international journal. International journals publish in the English language, so if you are a non-native English speaker, this can be very difficult. So if there is unclear, vague, or poorly written text, this could be justification for rejection. It is important, however, to understand that language concerns are not just grammatical or spelling or sentence structure errors. Sometimes they're specifically unclear statements that are ambiguous to a peer reviewer. It's very important to remember that language needs to be clear to the reviewer, because if they cannot understand what you're saying, then they cannot assess the science for its rigor. And lastly, if there is a lack of comparisons with the international literature in the discussion, that may be cause for the journal editor to reject your paper for publication. And we can discuss more of that as we move forward. So the first rule for our guide to international publishing today is to really understand that the core of academic writing or scientific writing is reuse. We as researchers build on the ideas of others, the language and the words of others. And therefore, it's essential for you to become comfortable with reusing and building upon, but not copying, because that would be plagiarism, this body of literature that's around you. So the first step in being successful in international publishing is to really, really learn the literature. This is something that you're going to be doing as becoming a graduate student and establishing yourself, is reading tons and tons of academic papers. And one thing that I strongly suggest you do is that you employ many of these modern tools that are around us to help manage that research literature that you are getting familiar with, and specifically build a personal research library, an easy way for you to go back, reference certain papers, know the authors, be able to sort them easily for you, because there is so much literature out there that it can definitely be daunting. And I have 3 listed options there for you to explore on your own and get familiar with. But most importantly, when you are citing the literature in your manuscripts, you want to make sure that your research is, or the literature is relevant to what you are working on, that it's up to date, and that it's also variable. And what I mean by that is that you're looking at, you might be doing research in one specific country, but similar research might have been in a different country. So cite literature from various countries, a variety of different journals, high impact and field specific, and then also from a variety of different lab groups or authors. Once you've really learned the literature, which is definitely a big task, it's a large part of starting a graduate degree, you want to analyze those published research articles, which is point 2 in our guide. And analyzing the research articles, of course, in terms of their science, is a large part of what you're going to be doing. But when you start wrapping your head and getting ready to publish, you want to analyze those research articles in terms of both the language used and the content and construction. So you can learn the construction of typical research articles simply just by reading them. And this is something that you probably do quite frequently, probably every day. If you already know what target journal or perhaps a few journals that you want to publish in, look at how those research articles are typically constructed and start trying to write your manuscript using that same structure. The second point is to examine how international authors convey their findings. So what are the patterns that these authors have used in their paragraphs or in those specific sections? Are there patterns you can identify and then build upon or mimic in your own writing? So I have an example here where an introduction is typically some generic beginning where it draws the reader in. So here I have a quote, "One area of increasing attention is." So this is where you highlight the importance of the research that you're doing. The middle section of the introduction is where you highlight that gap in knowledge. So most previous studies have not directly addressed the issue of blank. So after you highlight the significance, you state, oh, but there's a missing gap in knowledge. And then at the end, you clearly state what your specific study aims and objectives were, which is what I have for that third point. This is a very common pattern that you see in an introduction, and one that you can strive to use in your own writing for publishing in international journals. Along similar lines, again, it is important to address language issues. Again, international journals require English. They do sometimes allow an abstract that's in a different language. Most importantly, for non-native speakers, this is incredibly difficult. It is something that is very daunting, but it does also affect everybody. Just because you are a native English speaker does not necessarily mean that you are a good writer. So I think it's important to understand that we're all pretty much in this together. It's important to find a balance between the time spent polishing the writing, really working on that grammar, the spelling, the sentence structure, and the time spent refining your scientific arguments and content. As long as you ensure a simple, clear, and specific writing style, reviewers should be able to adequately assess your research. You can also look to others for assistance. Specifically, you can ask your colleagues and mentors to review and proofread your paper. This is something that you should be doing regardless, so that they can catch any scientific errors or places where you need to elaborate. There are, of course, editing services that can proofread your paper as well. Importantly, when you go to submit your work, remember that you need to ensure solid English in all written documents that you're submitting. So not just your manuscript, but also the cover letter that's going to be going with it. the response letters that you're going to write after your article has been accepted, but required revisions. And then also for any other scientific documents you might be writing in the future, any abstracts for conferences, any part of your CV for job applications. Again, this is something that we all work on throughout our careers, but it is important to work on this every day. And another point for addressing language issues is that there are electronic tools out there that can help you with your vocabulary and sentence variety. Some tools, as the first one I've listed here, allows people to put in an individual word or a phrase, and then it's going to return you phrases or words that are commonly put around that word in the scientific literature to kind of give you a leg up on how to construct sentences based on previous researchers. Google Scholar, you can use their search function to input a phrase or a word, and it will also return different grammatical structures that are appropriate for use. So this is kind of how you can kind of piece together sentences or make sure that you're expressing your science in similar ways to that has already been published. And then lastly, a technique that I've always used is to learn from published articles. If you find an author or a couple papers that you really like, or the way that something has been expressed, you can, take a few words from one sentence here, one sentence there, one sentence somewhere else, and piece them together to make a sentence. And after you do that, you're probably going to be editing your paper, and then all of a sudden you're going to have a really well-constructed paragraph that is in your own words, because you've paraphrased other articles, you've avoided plagiarism, and it's made your own, and it sounds like it's something that is well written and already in the literature. Our fourth comment for successful international publishing is identifying the right or most appropriate international journal. And this is a very difficult task. Identifying the right journal to publish in general can be an entire webinar by itself. But you should ask yourself what audience you would like to reach first and foremost. Are you looking for a really wide audience? Is your work applicable to not just your specific niche, but the greater international community? Or is your work very specific and only others that do your very, very similar work are going to be interested? That's the first question I think that you should ask yourself. Another question is, what type of research are you publishing? Is it mostly theoretical? Is it methodological? Is it quantitative or qualitative? That's something that you should identify, and then review the journal's aim and scope to see if your work fits in with their mission statement. A main tip here is to scan your references or your literature cited. Now you've built that research library, you've learned the literature from our first steps, and you'll probably start to see that your research that you're citing is often from 5 to 15 similar journals. There'll be those high impact journals that cover all types of research, but then you'll find these journals that are mostly related to your niche. Those journals are very likely going to have readers who are the most interested in your research, and those are going to be good targets for you. Once you identify those journals, what I have highlighted here in the orange box at the bottom is that you want to look through past issues of those journals that you've identified as possibly being good targets. If you see that your research aligns with past research that they've published, then I think it's a good idea that that's the right readership and the right journal for you to initially submit to. Along similar lines, it's also important to consider special issues of journals. So there's regular issues, and then sometimes there's special issues, which have specific themes or research foci that are described in what's known as a call for papers. These special issues often have very certain structures, they have shorter time frames, and they offer a lot of good opportunities specifically for early career researchers, but really for everybody. Because they have that specific structure required, this provides useful guidelines for you as you're organizing and writing your manuscript. And they often target researchers with similar interests, but across a diverse array of fields. So this allows you a wide readership and to also kind of get acquainted with other researchers that are doing similar research as you, but perhaps on the fringe of what you're doing. And therefore that might allow you to generate some collaborations with other researchers that are publishing in the same special issue. It's also important to note that special issue editors are often leading scholars in the field. So the journal might reach out to a certain researcher because they are interested in having a special issue. And this will offer junior researchers a really valuable experience of working with that leading scholar, gaining recognition by working with them, reading the other papers that are in that special issue, and really getting that experience. And as I said previously, special issues are oftentimes sensitive. That means that they have a deadline. And in some cases, that means the publication process can actually be shorter than for a regular issue if it's an expedited process. So that is something to kind of have in your back pocket. I do want to note that just because a special issue has all of these differences, it is equally peer reviewed, just like any other regular issue of that specific journal. So that doesn't mean that publishing in a special issue is necessarily easier than submitting to a regular issue in that same journal. Number 6 is, again, to provide context or background for your research. As you do your writing, it's very important to assume that readers in general are not going to be familiar with the geography of your study area. So for me, I was a geologist, and if I'm working in a certain part of Greenland, I can't just say Greenland or not even say Greenland at all, because my readers will not understand where my research is and why it is important for that specific area. If you can, and if it's appropriate within your research, you can always create a figure to illustrate that location. If you don't want to create an entire figure to show where your research area is, this is something that you can put in one of those small inset boxes in a figure that you've already created. You can also simply provide complete location information in the text for international readers. Providing context also is incredibly important because it helps you explain why your research is important. Why is your approach ideal for addressing your question? Why is the approach you're using in the specific area of the world important for addressing that specific research question? So it's important to really frame your work around that. Question 7, or point 7, is to ensure that your research is appealing in general, but of course to an international audience if you're targeting international journals. It's critical to explain why your research or science is of international interest, specifically why it's of international interest as opposed to only local or regional interest. And this can be more difficult than it sounds. Ask yourself, can your findings be applied to regions or people elsewhere in the world? And if your answer is yes, then you need to elaborate in your manuscript on how your results are transferable specifically. How do your data compare with previous studies that have been published elsewhere from other regions? And what can you learn from those comparisons, those similarities and differences between your data? And if your findings aren't really that applicable to other areas or people in the world, you can always elaborate on that a little bit more to make your manuscript stronger. So what can be done in future work to address international concerns or to make your work more applicable or transferable outside that region or country that you're working for? It's also important to frame your research for an international audience, really to target that international community. If your research is specifically of a local phenomenon or a specific process that's really only regional, again, you can compare your results with results of other researchers in your discussion section. This is what that discussion section is for. It is one of the hardest sections to write, but comparing your work with others is essential. And it is okay to kind of reach out a little bit and compare your work with similar studies in other countries. Cover letters are also very important for international publishing. If you are highlighting how your work is transferable or applicable to countries other than where the research was conducted, the cover letter is another place where you can do that. It's another opportunity to state why your study is important beyond your country's specific borders. So my last point for our guide to international publishing is one that is pretty simple, which is seeking feedback from your supervisors and colleagues. Your mentors, peers, colleagues, and even journal editors have great insight. They may have more expertise than you. They may have been in the academic game for much longer, and therefore you should really talk to them understand, you'll learn so much from them. You're probably going to learn which journals are most appropriate for your research from your research advisor and from your mentor and from those discussions that you have. If you're curious if your research is appropriate for a journal, it is totally okay to reach out to that journal editor, provide a case for your research and for your manuscript, and ask if it is appropriate, and if it's not, what you can do to revise to make it appropriate for publication in that journal. So before we get to the Q&A portion of today's presentation, I do want to address the question that many researchers ask, which is, what about high impact journals? You know, when am I going to know if my research is appropriate for a high impact publication? And really, I think the best way is to honestly assess your work, which is something that I've said in a previous webinar before. You need to ask yourself questions about the research that you're doing and try to kind of take a step back, because we all get a little bit of tunnel vision and of course are very proud of the research that we're doing. But you need to really ask yourself, are your results surprising? Are they provocative in your field? Do they challenge a widely held paradigm? And do they change the community's understanding in a significant way? And if you can answer these questions with a yes, then high impact journals may be a good option for you. They will likely be a little bit more competitive, mainly because they have so many submissions per year. But if you answer those questions with a yes, then I do encourage you to try for a high impact publication. I do also always encourage people to ask their advisor if they think that that is also appropriate. Another question is, does the study that you're doing use a novel tool or a new technique or an investigative approach that is new and different? If that's true, then a high impact journal may also be appropriate. And one of the best ways is, if your topic that you're working on is of current interest within your community, or it has timely importance, then a high impact journal may also be very interested in that. If you're working on a topic that is very controversial, something that is vigorously discussed or rapidly evolving, a field that draws a lot of attention, not just within your niche community, but across a variety of different academic spheres, then again, that is something that a journal editor of a high impact publication may be interested in. On the other hand, some points I've listed here are reasons that your work may not be quite appropriate for a high impact, broad readership journal. If your results are really solid, they're strong, but they don't lead to a fundamentally new understanding, then unfortunately your work may not quite be ready for a high impact journal. If the approach you used is one that's tried and true, so it's been established for many years, it's a strong approach, but there's really no innovative aspect, again, that might not be quite powerful enough for a journal editor to accept your manuscript. If your topic is of interest to only a small community, a journal editor may turn that down, and it may not be because it's not interesting, but from a journal's point of view, remember, they are a little bit of a business, so if they see that only a small number of citations might emerge from your publication, they may also not be interested. And then all of those kind of not surprising ways to ensure acceptance are also important. So in general, if your manuscript is poorly written, if your conclusions are not supported, if your manuscript is not structured by the guidelines, etc., those are all reasons that you also may not have your manuscript accepted in a high impact journal for publication. I do also want to point out a common mistake, one that many journal editors have stated before, is that as authors, if we are doing a ton of research, we've generated a ton or a high volume of data, we may feel that our research is deserving of being in a high impact journal simply because we have that high volume of data that we're reporting. And unfortunately, that is not the case. Just because you have a lot of data and it's sound data doesn't mean that it deserves publication in a high impact journal. So with that, I'm going to take down this presentation and open up for questions. Again, if you do have questions, please input them into the discussion board on the side of the stream in PeerRef. You can continue doing this as Rong and I discuss some of the questions and get our chat going. So if you're stimulated by another attendee's question or you're stimulated by some answer that we say, please join the conversation by asking different questions based on your own experiences and thoughts that you've had during the webinar. So just bear with us real quick while we get some of our questions in order. And I want to thank everybody that for joining us today.
Okay, so we.
Hey, Ron. All right, good to have you with us and back.
All right, so we got one question here is, what factor do you think high impact journals in the biomedical field begin with?
Oh, Ron, I might throw that one at you because that's your background.
Okay, so well, high impact, I think that different people would have different opinions. But I have impact factor 5 or 6, I think. Yeah, that's a good range to say that's a high impact journal. Of course, there are many biomedical journals, and many of them have a much higher impact factor than that. But then, of course, there are many like specialty specific journals. Those may not have very high impact factors, but then like people in the field may actually think those are high impact journals. So that's it's not really such a high close correlation between the impact factor and then actually the impact of a journal.
I guess I'm curious, this is just a question of my own since I've never really got to ask you this before, but do you think that researchers should be targeting journals that are more appropriate for their research? So like you said, some researchers might have a really high opinion of a journal, but it has a lower impact factor, but it's the top journal in their field. But many researchers are swayed to publish in journals that are more broad readership, higher impact journal, science, nature, things like that. What do you think is more appropriate for, I guess, establishing someone's career?
I think for if you're like it's still about your research. If your research is like more appropriate for the subject area audience researchers, then you should you know, think of journals that are like very specific for the field, because all your peers of the field will read that journal. But then if you think your research actually has applications outside your field, and other readers will be interested, then I think you should seek for like more multidisciplinary journals. Yeah, so it's still about the research and then what field you're trying to get into.
Yeah, I agree. It does look like we have one question here in the chat on Zoom. And the question is, if a manuscript is poorly written, is that a sufficient reason for rejection? Ron, what do you think?
Now, I think journal editors are trying to establish or this rule that reviewers shouldn't say this paper should be rejected because it's poorly written. But then if it's so poorly written that nobody can read it, then there's no way this can be accepted, right? So your journal has to be, your paper has to be reasonably written that editors, reviewers can understand it before they can judge the science in it, right? Yeah, so if it's so poorly written, editors will reject it. We call it a desk rejection. But this is not something about your science because they can not be, they're not able to judge your science. So you should not be discouraged about your science, but then you should really work hard to get the language to be standard.
Yeah, I agree. As you said, and as I said in the presentation, if a reviewer can't assess whether or not your science is rigorous and if it's relevant and appropriate for the journal, then because of poor writing, whatever that may be, structure, content, or specifically grammar or something, it will unfortunately be rejected. However, a lot of journal editors do return it to you to revise in terms of language before they send it out for review if they are interested in the topic, if it's appropriate for the journal, and they can see through some of the poorly written sections that your science is interesting and deserves peer review. Do we have any other questions from the peer ref side of things?
Yeah, so here's another question. What do you think about publishing in MDPI? Is MDPI less authoritative than, for example, elsewhere? So what do you think, Katie?
MDPI is, I believe, it's a fully open access publisher.
Right.
So that's a whole other, I guess, discussion that we can have, but I don't think that researchers should be discouraged from open access publishing. Elsevier also has open access options, as do the other big publishers that you might know. Wiley, for example, is very strong at moving forward with open access publishing. I have heard that MDPI has reputations within certain spheres of academia is not accepting a lot of international articles from certain sets of authors. I think personally that is really just a rumor. I wouldn't shy away from MDPI. I think that they're a credible publisher. They have a lot of a variety of different disciplines that they publish in. So I think fields for everyone here that perhaps is listening. So yeah, I think that they are a reputable publisher, someone, a good publisher to look into. They do pride themselves also on transparent metrics and short review times, for example. Rong, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I think, well, they are both like big publishers. They have a lot of journals. So I don't think one is less authoritative than the other. It's really still about what the journals publish, what your research is, how many, like open access journals, of course, then they usually reach a lot more readers.
Mm-hmm.
But then, yeah, it's still about the journal and your research, how they fit. Here's another question. Are there specific topics that appeal more to international journals? And should I start thinking about my research bearing those topics of interest in mind, or just do my work and try my luck? Be interested to a lot of our listeners. So.
I think you should be doing your work and trying your luck, because that's what you're interested in doing, and there will always be opportunities for publishing for you. I think all research can be interesting to anybody. Again, it's how you frame your research specifically. Yeah, I don't know, Ron, I'm curious your opinion on this.
Yeah, I agree what you said to frame your research. I think when you want, like international journals, especially high impact journals, they want general interest, a lot of readers, right? So then of course you should frame your research so that it's appealing to a lot of readers. And then of course there are like trendy topics or things that is on everybody's mind. So if you can frame your research to those areas, then of course people, I think that will attract a lot of readers. And then I think sometimes it's not like it's not just you just do your research and then you think your research is going this way. But then I think like acquire funding and then publishing it, sometimes it does affect whether your research is interested or trending. You shouldn't, it's not like you have to find all the trending topic and then work on it. But I think, yes, frame your research. Think of your research, how it can apply to the questions that are urgently, like on everybody's mind in this day. So that it does, you need to like steer your research, I'd say steer research to things that are more applicable to a lot of people.
I think that's a really good point. And I also want to indicate to our listeners right now that kind of all what we're saying right now, framing your research or steering it towards more applicable to an international audience or just a wider audience in general. This is something that, Rong, you just touched on is really important for grant writing and proposals as well. Those big trendy topics might get a lot of attention from some of the bigger funding agencies that you're writing for. And then the smaller, more niche topics, those are probably better for these smaller pots of money that are from those societies that support you and are interested there. So learning how to frame your research for an international journal is also a skill that you can kind of reuse towards framing your proposals or your research grants that you're writing to get funding.
Oh, here's an interesting question. Is it a valid reason for journal to reject a paper that they could not find reviewers for the paper after more than 8 months, although paper was in the same area as journal?
That, I think, is on the journals. That's the journal's fault. That's a journal editor's job, is to find appropriate reviewers. I've heard from many journal editors many times that finding reviewers is the most frustrating part of the job that they have. But that's, in my opinion, not an appropriate reason to be rejected. Personally, that's something that I would see as appropriate for you to speak up to the chief journal editor and perhaps appeal that decision even. Rong, what about you? Have you ever had any experiences with that?
I think like the journal editors we've talked to, they always try very hard to find reviewers. So then, if they reject, I think it's really not your fault. It's the journal's fault. But I don't know. Maybe the journal didn't try hard, or they couldn't find anyone. But then maybe at this point you want to find a different journal. Right?
Yeah, that's true. Maybe you don't want to work with that journal.
Yeah.
That was a very good question.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think about some research being so much ahead of its time that it may not be accepted by the community, as was the case with Boltzmann?
From what I can understand about that question, I think I may not know the specific example that you're referencing, but I do always really appreciate researchers that are kind of pushing the boundaries. In my field, we had someone who published a paper that was kind of against the main fundamentals of the research that I did. And, it takes a lot of gut for that person to do that and to step out and to put their research out there for others. And, that was one of the reasons I said why you should be publishing is to get your research out there. So I think that's something really to be proud of. So I would strive to get that research published if it's grounded and you have good reasoning to put that research out there. Because again, that's something that people are probably going to find very interesting. It's going to gain a lot of attention. So I think you should be very excited about that.
Yeah, right. I think if you believe in your research, you should get it published. Although, even if it's not accepted by a lot of people at the beginning. I haven't done any research like that, but I think you should believe in yourself. Yeah. Now another question: why open access journal is very expensive? Like it for a person, it's Indonesian 2,500 USD dollars. Very expensive.
So the reason for those costs for journals that can be super expensive is that the normal traditional model, which is known as the subscription model, is where the university that you go to pays the big publishers for the subscription so that you as a graduate student can read all the articles that you want for free. And all of that money that your university is paying goes to pay the business costs of the publisher. So paying those journal editors, the copy editing fees, all of the stuff that goes to making the journal what it is. If there's no traditional model, so there's no subscription, so your university isn't paying for that, that's where the costs come in from the author. So those costs are basically, again, for that journal to be putting out the papers that it is, to pay for the journal editors, to pay for the copy editing processes, all of things like that. And it is definitely extremely variable per journal, per publisher, and per country. And that's something that the open access movement is really trying to figure out. We have the same questions that you do, is why is it so expensive in other countries and not as expensive in others? So Rong, do you have any thoughts on kind of the open access processing charges and things like that to share?
No, I mean, it is expensive is because they cannot charge the readers. Now I think the publication community needs to figure out what is a reasonable price for the open access publishing. Do you know, is like the Plan S, are they going to have like a cap for the price?
I'm actually not sure if they're going to have a cap. I think that's something that they were working on. There's been so many changes to that, but that is implemented now. So yeah, that's a good question. So there are a lot of changes. I would encourage the authors or the listeners right now to read up on open access. This is something that I think is going to impact a lot of you if it hasn't already, and it's something to be aware of and perhaps engage in if that's of interest to you. So things are always changing, but yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, that's something changing, and then the community is still trying to figure out. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we don't have a good answer for the question, unfortunately, because we're still trying as a publishing community to figure it out ourselves. So why don't we do maybe one or more questions if we have any, and then we can wrap up the webinar. I know folks get Zoom fatigue these days, so about an hour is probably what we're shooting for. If you don't have any questions, I can ask you one, Rong. I always do this to our co-hosts.
Okay.
I guess my question is, what general advice do you have for researchers that are maybe for their first time trying to publish in an international journal? What are the main things that they should be making sure their manuscript does or includes or doesn't include before they have their first submission?
I think first read international journal papers. So especially journals like you want to publish in. So see how they frame their work, and then how they write, and then how they frame their questions, how they address their questions, and then how they discuss what their finding applies to the community, to the field. And then think of your question not just about your field, your geologic location. Like if you're doing something in China, not think of your research just about China, or about your city, about your country, but then think people outside China, why would they be interested in your research? Now, it's maybe your finding can apply to other people, other countries. So if you don't say it, people don't know. So you really have to spell it out in your paper. So that's why I think a lot of a major problem is when you read this, you're wondering why would anyone outside China be interested in this paper. So I think that's a big problem for people who's first time writing a paper for international journal. Yeah, and then of course frame your findings so that there's something useful for people outside to use, right? So then they would learn something, and then that would help you get published in international journals.
I think that's great advice. I agree with it 100%. So yeah, I think just understand that your research is interesting to others, and that it's great that you're doing it. So I think with that, if there are any additional questions that are in the PRF discussion board, remember that you can ask those questions in our LetPub webinar discussion hub on PRF. So we can continue this conversation. Rong and I can chime in. Our other individual, Dr. Clark Holdsworth, is usually with us on these webinars. Took a break for today, but he can join us on PRF and answer some of the questions that you have for the next month. Before Rong and I say goodbye for the day, I do just want to remind everybody that you will be receiving this on-demand video recording. This is something that you just need to access the original webinar page and register for that on-demand recording, and you'll get the entire presentation and the discussion that we had here at the end. In the follow-up email, you'll also receive the certificate of completion for the webinar if that is of interest to you. And yes, I just want to say thank you for joining us for this initial webinar of the 2021 LetPub webinar series. Rong, it was wonderful to have you as my co-host today. You are welcome back anytime for any webinars that we do. Your insight was very beneficial for the attendees and very interesting. So with that, I think we're gonna end the webinar for today. So thank you everybody for tuning in and listening wherever you are. It's great to stay connected. Thank you, Rong.
Bye. Thank you.